Due to an unfortunate and completely unplanned and unforeseen fireworks accident, my dog Bailey now needs a new house. And since it's the coldest time of year, I decided to make a heated floor and Wi-Fi capabilities to keep her warm on even the coldest Canadian days. Alright, in all seriousness, this old doghouse had the floor rotting out of it and the shingles falling off, and it was really good for nothing other than firewood. So this build is going to be way over the top for a doghouse. It's honestly like pretty much just building a tiny house for a dog. But I've never really built any exterior structures before, and I have some builds coming up this year where I'm going to be, so this is going to be a great introductory and getting to try everything on a small scale. And that includes like roofing, sheeting, insulation, all that stuff, really everything except for the foundation. So first I'm making up a little deck for the doghouse to sit on, and I'm using some cedar 2x4s, and then I'll be using cedar deck boards on top. I decided to go with cedar because of its outdoor protection, and I just really like the look of cedar versus pressure treated, and I really want to go for that kind of modern orangey cedar look on this one in the end, because my dog can totally tell, right? So after about an hour I had the frame whipped up and I put in some blocking around where the base of the doghouse is going to be for insulation purposes, and now I'm ready to put on some decking. I used some popsicle sticks to space the boards evenly, and then I used my finger to kind of space the screw so they were all in a relatively similar position from the edge of the board. And then I just fastened on every deck board with two 2-inch screws on every stud. The last board wasn't quite full width, so I just measured that out, and then I'm gonna rip a board with my Craig track saw jig. Once it was cut, I used a 1/4-inch round over bit on my router just to give it that same kind of round finish as the other side. Once the deck was done, I flipped it up on its side, and I'm going to insulate underneath where the house is going to be, since the floor of the deck is essentially the subfloor of the house. So I have this 2-inch rigid insulation, and I'm going to cut it about a 1/2 inch short on each dimension, and then I'll spray foam it in place into the framing of the deck. I spray foamed around all the cracks and gaps so that this seal is pretty much weatherproof once the house is sitting on top. Now I'm ready to start the frame, and for this I'm just using some regular 2x4s like you would on a house. I did the stud spacing at about 24 inches, and I made sure the bottom board on each wall was cedar so that any water coming in off the deck won't rot out the wood. So I made the first 3 walls at 24 inches tall, and the 4th wall is going to be 30 inches tall, and it's going to have a lean-to style roof. For the door, I framed it in at 18 by 18 inches. And on 2 of the walls, I'm building this separate portion out of 2x3 lumber instead of 2x4 so that it has a 1-inch indent. And then there's going to be these accent cedar slats in this indent once it's all finished that'll be different from the rest of the walls. So basically, I just framed a 2x4 wall and a 2x3 wall and then just screwed it together as one wall. With all the walls laid out, all I had to do was make sure each wall was completely square to the deck itself and to each perpendicular wall. Then I screwed the wall into the base using a 3-inch deck screw about every foot or so. And that's the frame and foundation fully finished in about half a day. Now this doghouse is going to have a heated floor in it, so for electrical I just have this 50-foot extension cord, and I'm going to cut off the female end of it and feed it directly into a junction box. Then I'll just have to plug the doghouse into one of the exterior house outlets for the winter. So I just cut back 3 or 4 inches of the jacket and then stripped each individual wire. Then I installed 2 4-inch electrical boxes where I'll be connecting all the wires, and drilled a hole through the base plate of the wall and the floor to feed the wire up into the first electrical box. By the way, I am no electrician. I do a lot of research, but don't take the word of anything I say here too seriously, and always do your own research if you're doing a build. Then after drilling some holes through the studs, I mounted another utility box and ran some normal household 14-2 wire from one box to the other. Then at that main junction box, I put in another just short piece of 14-2 wire that runs to the other box right above it. And then I stripped back the wires and connected all 3 black wires with one of these wire nuts. And did the same thing with all 3 white wires and all 3 ground wires, and I also connected one of the grounds to one of the ground screws in the box itself. So this is the heated floor panel I'm using. It's meant to go underneath laminate flooring, and it's really easy to use. You basically just roll it out and cut it to the length that you need and hook it up to the thermostat. As for the thermostat, you're going to need one that's specific to in-floor heating, and I spent a little bit extra and got this one that has Wi-Fi so that I can monitor the temperature and turn it on and off from inside my house, and I don't have to come outside and crawl inside the doghouse to change that. So to hook it up, first I took the temperature sensor that came with it and fed it in through the back of the unit and screwed it into its corresponding terminals. Then you really only have 4 wires to hook up, so I hooked up the black and white wire that comes from the wall, and then the black and white wire that comes from the heating pad or the load. Then I can install the faceplate and plug the doghouse extension cord into some power and see if this thing lights up. After running through the quick setup and fault testing, everything's checking out and the thermometer says it's definitely working. So I unplugged it and cut the sheet to size, cutting between the black strips. And then used these pieces of Captain tape to seal off the end of the leads. Then I pulled up the heating pad temporarily to prep the floor underneath. I had to chisel in a few spots for some wires and some connections on the heating pad. And then I spray foamed all the gaps to get this as weather tight as possible in here. The heating pad says it's waterproof, so it should be fine for any minimal water that makes its way through the door or any small cracks that are left. So I put down a couple layers of underlay for added insulation and then taped the heating pad into place. I secured all the loose wires. I also taped the temperature sensor about 1 inch from the edge of the heating surface. Then I installed the floor right away to protect it from getting damaged from anything else I do. I'm using some cheap vinyl plank flooring, and vinyl's 100% waterproof, so I don't have to worry about any water coming in through the door or just on my dog's nasty body damaging the floor. Then I used some silicone to seal in around the doorway so water can't get underneath the flooring. And now I can finish up the rest of the electrical quick. So I have these deck lights that I'm going to use in the soffit of the doghouse, but I want to wire these inline inside the wall, so I made a cut in the AC power cable. And then I'm going to connect in this inline smart switch so I can control the power with my phone. Now I can cut the plug off that one and wire it directly into the junction box. And now I'm going to do almost the same thing with some outdoor LED strip lights. I have the original 12 volt power adapter here that I cut the end off of. And I'm instead going to wire this into an inline 12 volt inverter, so I don't need to have this plugged into a wall socket. And with that wire hooked up to the output, I can then solder the smart switch onto the AC input, and then the AC cable coming from the junction box will be wired straight into this smart switch. Then I just kind of organize everything nicely within the wall and wired both circuits into the second junction box. These circuits will control the deck lights, which I'm actually using in the soffit of the roof, and the LED strip light, which is going to be to light up an accent piece that I'm building later. Now I'm going to cut up a template rafter. So I squared a line off the wall, and then I used something to space the pencil up a little bit. For me, it was just this USB cable that was the perfect height. And then I can cut this out with a jigsaw to have the rafter sit perfectly on both walls. Also, a quick tip: if you take your speed square and then line it up with your squared line off the wall, I always just draw a little tick on the speed square, and then you can replicate that angle wherever you need it on the board. Once I was happy with how that was sitting, I just labeled this as a template piece and used it to cut out 5 or 6 more rafters. Now I'm just going to set those aside for now while I finish up the interior walls. So I have this 3/8 inch finished plywood that I got super cheap at Home Depot. It was like 35 bucks for the sheet. And I'm just cutting up each wall panel according to its dimensions. And then nailing it in place with some 18 gauge nails. On this wall, I'm cutting in this 6x9 inch access panel so that I can get into those smart switches if I ever have any connection issues. Then I just use some white caulk to seal around all the edges. And the interior is pretty much done. Now I'm going to insulate the walls, and I'm using that same 2-inch rigid insulation and some expanding foam around the edges. After a couple hours, I could go around and cut off all the excess. And now I'm going to wrap everything in some home wrap. So I just taped it in place to start and then started stapling it around the entire perimeter of the frame. Then I taped up any little cuts I had to make. And patched in around the door jamb. Now I have one of these shed siding panels, and I'm going to use some white exterior paint and give it a couple coats. And after that dries overnight, I can cut my panels to size and start fitting them into some walls. I nailed each panel in place with some 1.5 inch galvanized brad nails. And I only covered up 3 walls in siding because the rest is all going to be covered in cedar paneling once I get the roof and everything else on. Now I have this cheap, like $30 window I got on Amazon. It's usually used on boats and yachts, but I'm going to use it on a doghouse. It's got 2 screws that allows you to open it up from the outside, which would be great in the summer, so I can open up this window and allow airflow to come in through the door and out through the window, and reduce the heat inside the doghouse. So I cut that out with the jigsaw, and then I used this long drill bit and a square to transfer the general placement of this window to the interior wall. Then I put a liberal bead of silicone around the window and pressed it into place and secured it with some screws in all the pre-drilled holes. So this part didn't actually come with the window. I had to 3D print this and it took about 3 or 4 hours to do that. But this is basically just an interior flange that covers up the guts of the wall. And I just siliconed it into place. Now I really don't need to access too much more inside, so I'm gonna cut a ceiling panel and get some rafters on. So first I just set the ceiling in place and put the 2 end rafters over top, and then I just kind of traced onto the rafters exactly where that's going to sit so that I could move it onto the floor and nail the ceiling into those rafters. Then once I took that back and made sure that was going to fit, I added in 2 more rafters and nailed everything solid. To screw the rafters in place, I just pre-drilled down about 1/2 or 3/4 inch. And then I used some 4-inch screws to hold each end in place. Now I'm adding on the fascia board so I can start filling in the rest of the roof. So I used my square to line up the position of the board, and then I did 2 screws into each stud. Then I installed the rake board by lining it up with the end of the wall at the one end, and then measuring that and duplicating the distance at the top. Then I added in some blocking all around the roof where I'm going to have to attach some soffit to. And then I squared off the ends and cut it flush with the rake boards. And this roof is framed up. Now on to the rest of the siding. I have these 6-inch wide tongue and groove cedar panels that I'm going to install along all the walls that haven't been covered yet and along the soffit. So I installed my starting piece first. After making sure it was completely level, I just brad nailed it into the top and bottom using some galvanized brad nails. I made this starting piece a little bit narrower because I measured the whole width and I was going to have like a 1/2 inch piece at the end. So I made this first piece narrower to widen up the last piece. Now I did pretty much the exact same thing along the soffit. One last finishing touch on the deck. I have a few spare deck boards, so I'm going to case around the entire thing. I think this makes it look quite a bit cleaner and you can't see the end grain of the deck boards anymore. And I also cut in the door jamb with some cedar planks quick. After a bit of sanding, it's time to stain and seal all this cedar. So I have this cedar natural tone deck stain from Olympic, and I'm going to cover basically all the visible cedar. Like I said, I wanted kind of that modern orangey cedar look on this one, although the cedar would probably be just fine without any sealer at all. But I'm really liking how this is looking so far, so I'm hoping once I get a black roof and a black fascia and trim, it's going to look pretty sharp and modern. Just before I started staining, I also cut up a bunch of these 1¼ inch wide deck boards. These are going to be used for some trim and accent pieces later, so I'm staining them all at the same time. Now before I close up the roof, I'm gonna install these deck lights. These are pretty straightforward. I really just drilled out some evenly spaced holes. And the light just pops itself into place, and then I connected all the wires with the easy connectors. Now time for the roof. So I've never done any roofing before, so stay tuned to watch my mistakes, but basically I have this aluminum drip edge from Home Depot and I'm going to line one end up flush with the end of the roof. And then I'm going to square off the other end and cut it with some tin snips, which I later switched out for aviation shears, which were a million times easier to cut with. Then I just mounted it on with roofing nails every foot or so. So the side pieces are the same drip edge, and I lined it up with the top and then traced on a cut line. And then I just nailed it in with one nail at the top. At the bottom, I squared a line off with the bottom piece of drip edge, and then I cut through the top portion. And underneath on this piece, I squared a line off the fascia board. And I should have just cut along this line like every YouTube video I watched said, but I thought I would cut this in and then just bend the corner around, but later on I had to cut this out anyway, so just cut this line. Turns out other people on YouTube that have actually done any roofing before do know what they're talking about. And I f***ed up again because this side drip edge shouldn't be on until I put the roofing underlay on first, and then the drip edge will go over top. And now time for some shingles. I was going to put a nice steel roof on this, but it was going to cost like 4 or 5 times as much, which seemed unnecessary for a doghouse. So I cut some starter strips from full shingles by just cutting them basically down the middle. And then I lined them up with the bottom of the roof with about a 3/8 inch overhang on the bottom and the side. Then I gave each shingle 4 nails, all spaced about a foot apart. Then I lined up the first full shingle pretty much right in line with the bottom and side of the starter strip. You also want to make sure the end of your shingle doesn't line up with the gap of the shingles below. Then I squared it with the top of the roof and gave it 4 nails. The next shingle just goes on right beside, and after nailing it on, I use this spare shingle to cut the edge with the 3/8 inch overhang. And once it was cut, I used a scrap piece to kind of sand off this edge, which is actually really satisfying. The next row, I measured over a 6-inch offset, and then lined up the bottom of the shingle with the bottom white line on the shingle below, and then nailed in our 4 nails. And we're going to keep doing this 6-inch offset on every row above. Once I cut off the overhang, I could bring these pieces back over to the right side and fill in the starter gap. And once I got to the top, I trimmed off all the excess overhang. And then I'm using one of these 4-inch by 4-inch pieces of aluminum flashing for the top edge. So I traced on the cut lines on each end and cut them out with my aviation shears. I left this little notch out at the top to cover up that overhang piece of drip edge. Then I applied 2 beads of some roofing repair. And nailed it in on the top side with 2 nails spaced out about every foot or so. And getting on to one of the last steps here, we're going to work on the fascia. So this is some fascia I picked up at Home Depot, and it's actually meant for 2x6 lumber, so it's a little over width for what I need. But I cut a short piece here, and I'm going to fit it onto that open end of the wall that's still exposed. And the width I needed happened to line up perfectly with one of these crease marks, so I'm just going to bend this around and do a 90-degree angle to cap off the backside. Like I said, this fascia is for 2x6 framing, so I'm going to strip a little bit off here for my 2x4 framing. Then I notched out this piece around the vertical wall. And I'm going to leave this little tab on here and bend it over so it looks a lot cleaner and more finished than a cut edge. Then I traced on the end lines. And instead of cutting these right on the line, I'm going to actually cut it about an inch over. And then I'll install this onto the fascia board, tucking it up underneath the drip edge. And that little inch tab I left on each end, I'm going to bend over and do a 90-degree angle around the corner. For the last 2 pieces, I could just cut the ends completely flush, other than I had to cut off this little tab to allow this piece to overlap with the other piece. And I could slide it in place under the drip edge. And then I just went around and fastened everything in with some aluminum trim nails. Then I used some black silicone to seal up any rough edges or exposed nails. And now we're really just into some finishing touches. So I'm making this kind of cedar slat accent piece that's going to be lit up from behind. So I basically just cased the indent at the top and bottom. And now I'm going to mount this LED strip onto the bottom board. The adhesive wasn't great on this LED strip, so I just used some silicone to hold it in place better for the long term. Now I'm just taking those 1¼ inch wide pieces of deck board that I stained earlier and spacing them out evenly around this corner. Now I just have some tiny little cut up pieces of cedar here that I'm painting white and black just to fill in some trim. As a last step, I have these vinyl flaps that are always used to hold temperature in hockey arenas and I don't know where else, I'm Canadian. So I just cut these into some door length strips and wedged them between two boards. And I'm just going to screw this in inside the door in the winters to hold the heat of the heated floor inside to some degree. And my just casual everyday doghouse is now complete. So the LED lights look like they're flickering here, but it's actually just the frame rate of the camera. These look completely solid in person. As for heat, on a pretty average winter day of about -6, the inside temperature of the doghouse was sitting right around 10 degrees, which is probably about perfect for Bailey at this time of year since she does have quite a bit of winter wool on. You don't want it too hot in there. I can control both sets of lights from my phone with Wi-Fi and also adjust the temperature of the thermostat from anywhere. Bailey does spend most of her time in the house, but she is a country dog and she likes to spend a lot of time outside, especially at night or when we're gone, and this gives her a good place to warm up even on the coldest days when we aren't home. Total power usage with everything turned on is just over 100 watts, so the $30 power bill to keep my dog alive for 3 months of the year seems pretty reasonable. This was a super satisfying build with how fast it progressed, and I think the end result looks pretty awesome. Again, it's probably way over the top for a doghouse, but like I said before, I have a bunch of builds coming up where I'm going to be building similar structures to this, and this was a really good dry run for that. You could also really just scale up these dimensions and make your own shed or tiny house that look pretty similar to this with using pretty much the exact same techniques. So I look at it as basically a $2,000 education run. I'd love to hear in the comments below if you think 2,000 Canadian dollars is unreasonable for a doghouse or if that's just what stuff costs nowadays. If you like this kind of stuff, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It goes a long way in helping out channels like mine to make better and better content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.